Okay, we can start. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So before starting our last seminar for this period, this bunch, I just want to give you some background information about the Borderscape project. The project aims at investigating how the Egyptian state formation changed the socio-spatial landscape of the Nile First Cataract region in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. The team members of this project are two, myself, the PI, and Oren, Dr. Oren Siegel, who is the junior researcher. Our project is funded by the Norway Grants, working together for a green, competitive and inclusive Europe, and the National Science Center of Poland through the Pol's Call. And we are based at the Institute of Mediterranean and Oriental Cultures of the Polish Academy of Sciences. If you want to know more about our project, please go to our website or to our social media accounts, pages, or if you want, you can write us an email if you have any question about our project. So today's seminar is presented by our very own Oren Siegel, and the title is Re-evaluating Aspects of Inter-Polity Boundaries in Middle and New Kingdom Egypt. Let me give you a short introduction of Dr. Oren Siegel. Oren received his PhD with honors from the University of Chicago in June 2020, with a dissertation titled The Development and Symbolism of Monumental Enclosure Walls Prior to the New Kingdom. His research interests include borders in the ancient Egyptian world, pharaonic architecture and landscape archaeology and GIS applications, urbanism in the dynastic period. As an archaeologist, he has worked at various sites across Egypt and Sudan, including Tel Edfu, Dendera, Aswan, Uronarti, and Mendes. Currently, he is a field archaeologist for the Aswan Komombo Archaeological Project and the Uronarti Regional Archaeological Project. His research has been published in the Journal of Egyptian History, JARCI, and Antiquity. Let me give you brand new news about Oren. Sadly, he's leaving our project because his his contract is over, but thanks, and I'm very happy to say this, is joining the Indiana University as lecturer for Egyptology for the upcoming academic year. So thank you very much, Oren, for all your work for our project. I hope that you will continue collaborating with us, but good luck for your future, and particularly with the Indiana University position. So, Oren, the floor is yours. I stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, Maria. And yeah, I'll go ahead and get right to it and start sharing my screen.
Meantime, let's remind everybody to turn off your camera and your mic. Thank you. And then we can start again when there is at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right, so good afternoon, and thank you all for attending my talk. Today, I'll be discussing political borders in ancient Egypt, what they looked like, how they operated, and how they were conceptualized. One of the elements I'll be discussing are boundary stelae, like the one shown here. It originates from Uronarti, a site I've been privileged to work at, and this picture is from the Khartoum National Museum in Sudan from 2019. I think we're all aware of the tragic events unfolding in Sudan, and so I would just like to take a moment to wish for the peace and safety of our Sudanese colleagues and all Sudanese people before moving forward with my talk. Thank you. So to start, I actually want to begin by talking a little bit about some of the political borders we encounter ourselves. Especially during the height of COVID, we all were leading rather circumscribed lives. But even now, we continue to inhabit an extraordinarily bordered world. Many of us flash an ID card on a daily basis to enter a university library or building, or cross county or state lines during a commute. We are inured to invasive searches every time we board a plane and submit to passport checks that collect copious amounts of personal data whenever we travel beyond the bounds of our respective nations. The past decades have witnessed a proliferation of border walls that, despite their massive expense and almost complete ineffectiveness, serve as powerful nationalistic symbols. Horrific events at the southern border of the United States have served to underscore how we derive nearly all of our human rights from our citizenship within a nation state and the vulnerability of refugees within the world order that we have built. In our international order, virtually all states claim a monopoly on the right to exercise legitimate violence within their carefully defined borders. Different states might violently disagree about where a border should be located or who can freely cross it, but essentially no polity is challenging the organizing principle that sovereignty is grounded in territory. Years ago, I think the rise of ISIS was shocking for many more important reasons, but also because it was a terrorist organization whose actions challenged existing territorial logics, as we can partially see from this map from 2015. But our system of borders is also historically contingent. It's hard to imagine them looking the way they do if we lacked the distance demolishing technologies of the industrial age or the data collection and aggregation tools from our own information age. In fact, it's quite possible that they would be drastically altered if Western Europe had approached ideas about private property differently in the early modern period. It's precisely because the political borders we experience ourselves are often so broadly similar, but also the product of a very particular historical process that I think we need to, at times, carefully re-examine some of our assumptions when we talk about these features during the Pharaonic period. Before addressing Egyptian border making efforts, I think it's necessary to define how I'll be using the terms border, frontier, and boundary in this talk, since a lot of confusion can arise from the semantic overlap between these terms. The late Bradley Parker's studies of Neo-Assyrian frontiers and borderlands are extremely useful in this regard, not least because his research includes pre-modern boundary-making practices. Parker situates borders and frontiers along a continuum of boundary types, with borders being more static and less permeable than frontiers, which he views as relatively more fluid and porous. Boundary is a general term that for Parker encompasses the totality of this spectrum, while borderlands are comprised of the geographic, mental, social, and even metaphysical spaces where borders and frontiers are imposed. Critically, he notes that in the ancient world, not all territory was claimed, and a state's boundaries often delimited it from the surrounding wilderness rather than rival polities. Though extremely useful as a heuristic device for interrogating the reality of life in borderlands, the spectrum between Parker's borders and frontiers maps imperfectly onto Egyptian terminology, where two types of boundaries are commonly distinguished: tASw and Jeru. However, the distinction between these terms reflects neither porosity nor permeability, but rather the capacity for human action to change them. Jeru correspond to purportedly immutable, perhaps normative boundaries, while Tash has traditionally been translated by Egyptologists as sphere of influence or frontier, though others simply prefer the term boundary. Crucially, tASw belong to the realm of boundaries or limits that may be set and altered through political action, particularly those actions undertaken by the pharaoh. The formulation Sewesek Tashu, broadening the boundaries, has been cited as a mode that Egyptian sources use to describe the imperial ambitions of the Pharaonic state. Jose Galan notes that tASw must be actively constructed, while Jeru were more passive features, a distinction that is reflected in how the terms are employed in Egyptian texts. Jeru are often brought to victorious Egyptian pharaohs, while tASw are pretty much always made or established, and must be maintained through subsequent border-making efforts. For the purposes of scope today, I'm going to be focusing on the term Tash, and in particular on Inter-Polity boundaries. Before I discuss tASw in more detail, I want to make a brief excursus to note the kind of evidence I'll be considering today and foreground the arguments I'll be making. So with both ancient and modern boundary making, there are differences between the state's intentions for a political boundary and the lived experience of individuals in the borderlands. In pharaonic sources, there are often a pronounced difference between bombastic royal rhetoric and the considerably more nuanced picture of borderlands that emerges when archaeological evidence is considered. I want to emphasize that today I'm analyzing how the ancient Egyptian state and its elites conceived of boundaries, not because of the primacy of this vision, but rather to challenge what I think are tenuous assumptions regarding how these elite political actors are defining Egypt's borders, and how these assumptions have then dramatically informed how scholars have interpreted life in such regions. I'll be focusing today on the perspectives of the Pharaonic elite because I really do think that misunderstandings of their conception of political boundaries complicate efforts to understand how, what, and why local communities were resisting, challenging, adapting, or acquiescing to particular border-making practices. Even though royal or elite sources should be most prone to exaggerate Pharaonic state power and capacity, I think the extant evidence suggests a perhaps slightly different approach to space and territoriality. A clear grasp of the approach of Pharaonic authorities boundary making will hopefully allow for new insights into some of the archaeological evidence, administrative texts, or personal letters that document a less idealized perspective on Pharaonic borderscapes. I want to also note that while all of the overlapping practices underlying the establishment and maintenance of cultural, geographic, demographic, economic, or administrative boundaries within ancient Egypt, of course, warrant further study. For reasons of scope, I'm really just focusing on those practices that serve to construct and maintain Inter-Polity boundaries, and specifically those termed tASw, during the latter half of the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. There are a few reasons for this temporal focus. First, we have extensive textual and archaeological evidence related to these kinds of boundaries from these periods. Second, these are areas where Egypt is a relatively centralized imperial power, actively seeking to intervene diplomatically, militarily, and economically in neighboring regions. In short, these were periods when pharaohs actively sought to construct an Egyptian sphere of political influence, in part through the use of tASw. Third, following the Middle Kingdom, pharaohs from all of these eras consciously linked their own military and political border-making policies with those of their predecessors. Thus, Thutmose III is renewing Lower Nubian temple foundations from the reign of Senwosret III and forms a model for pharaohs like Seti I and Ramses II. And then finally, unlike earlier or later periods, there is some textual evidence and as well as archaeological evidence that suggests that some of the assumptions that the state or pharaohs and elite political actors in the pharaonic state, that some of these assumptions seem to be persisting across these periods. And lastly, a brief note on my theoretical priors. Research by geographers, historians, anthropologists, and political scientists that in recent decades has been loosely grouped together under the rubric of border theory highlights certain aspects that have been overlooked, I think, in some discussions of ancient Egyptian boundaries. Rather than simply lines on a map or natural boundaries, political borders are socially constructed through a host of boundary-making practices, many of which are intimately intertwined with the expression and performance of sovereignty. Even seemingly natural borders located at an ocean or river are in part social constructs. For instance, just as the United Nations decision to recognize a polity's territorial sovereignty up to 12 nautical miles from its coastline is an arbitrary political measure, so too did early Middle Kingdom pharaohs intervene to designate the water rights of individual nomes, or provinces. Both ancient and modern borders attempt to concretize social boundaries in physical space, and because social and geographic space rarely map perfectly onto one another, borders are often imposed by a power and subsequently contested. I think for ancient Egyptian borders, it can be particularly productive to reconceptualize state boundaries as a suite of social and material practices given the abundance of archaeological and textual evidence we have the opportunity to examine. So I guess in sum, I tend to prefer looking at borders through the lens of processes and practices. Returning to pharaonic boundaries, I think a good place to begin our investigation is by asking the question, what did an ancient Egyptian tash actually look like? There would seem to be no firm agreement, even within Egyptian sources, where a tash can seemingly reflect attempts to draw a sort of line in the sand, as with the boundary established by Senwosret III at Semna and commemorated on his year 8 stela, but in many other instances it seems to refer to a wider area or more nebulous Egyptian sphere of influence that exists decoupled from linear or Cartesian notions of territoriality. And so here I'm thinking of when it appears in the plural in the phrase Suesek Tashu, broadening the boundaries, or say when Hatshepsut claims on her Karnak obelisk that Amun-Ra granted her a Tashu extending to the shores of Punt, a region in Eastern Africa. Often it's hard to determine where we should even locate them. Are 18th dynasty Egypt's Inter-Polity boundaries to be located at, say, rock-cut stelae near the Euphrates and Kyrgyz, established by Thutmose I and Thutmose III, many kilometers away from any traces of Egyptian settlement? Or should scholars view ancient Egyptian boundaries as the limits of the territorial watershed within which the Egyptian state received taxes and tribute? Or should they be situated at the edge of the area that was directly integrated into the territorial structure of the empire? Or perhaps a tash can encompass some or all of these kinds of boundaries simultaneously. I'm not sure I have a totally clear answer myself. But because of this complexity, I favor a flexible definition where a tash is a royally established entity that demarcates a horizon within which the Pharaonic polity could levy taxes, requisition personnel, conscript or impress individuals, appropriate goods, engage in trade, send messengers, and partake in diplomacy, or inscribe itself upon the landscape in the form of monuments, fortresses, military campaigns, commercial expeditions, or ritual practice. In other words, it represents a kind of horizon within which one could potentially be subjected to the violent force of the Egyptian state. This differs dramatically from the boundary-making practices of contemporary nations that are founded upon fantasies of linear borders defining pristine, self-contained nation-states in a world with no unclaimed territory. The difficulty of simply determining the location of the precise tashu of Egypt in any period, to say nothing of the challenges of establishing a cogent definition of what one physically looked like, should serve as an obvious warning that ancient Egyptian priorities for their political boundaries did not always align with contemporary imperatives for an international border system that clearly demarcates areas that are both administratively and territorially integrated into the structure of the modern state. And indeed, although maps are known from ancient Egypt, there is no evidence, to my knowledge, that any Egyptian cartographer ever demarcated the extent of the Egyptian empire, or even Egypt itself, using neat lines clearly outlining distinct political boundaries. Here we see a purely topographic map of part of the Wadi Hammamat, but other examples, like Seti I's reliefs depicting the ways of Horus, some roads into southern Palestine from northeastern Egypt, located at Karnak, at least the reliefs are, they tend to depict land in a manner almost akin to the lists of conquered cities highlighted in onomastica or monumental inscriptions. With this juncture, I'd like to briefly outline three crucial distinctions between how I think Middle and New Kingdom pharaohs were approaching territoriality in their realm. I'll be spending much of the rest of this talk elaborating upon these differences, but for the sake of clarity, I'd like to put my cards on the table right away. First, pharaonic boundaries were defined by their were not defined by their permeability, but rather their capacity to be altered by royal action. Second, specific territorial claims were at times less vital than the sovereign act of claiming or making a boundary. And finally, ancient Egyptian boundaries were often, but not always, discussed in personal terms as belonging to a particular pharaoh, and were not intended to be ahistorical structures. And I'll come back to each of these in turn, but this hopefully gives a bit of a structure for the remainder of this talk. Much discourse surrounding modern political boundaries focuses on their relative permeability or impermeability, as do many models for approaching the comparative study of political boundaries anthropologically or archaeologically. Such research foci have produced extremely useful insights, models, and ethnographies, and represent a dynamic avenue for the future comparative study of political boundaries. However, this emphasis on permeability is very much a product of a particular mode of territoriality, operating especially in the Atlantic world from the 18th century onwards, and grounded in a kind of nationalism that many scholars hesitate to ascribe to the ancient world. The notion of natural borders containing a culturally unified nation animated the construction of borders during this era, even if this was always more of an ideal than a reality. As points of demarcation between a national self and a foreign other, such 18th and 19th century national borders invited fantasies of impermeability and ethnic purity. Geographers and historians broadly agree that this specific politically charged understanding of a sacred and viable national territory was a historically contingent phenomenon that was subsequently imposed and extended and modified throughout the globe over the course of the colonial projects of the Atlantic powers in the 19th and 20th centuries. This nationalist understanding of territorial sovereignty still governs our world today. Sovereign nation states remain the organizing units of international relations, even as a globalized economy has allowed goods and commerce to proceed with decreasing friction, all while the passage of actual people remains strictly regulated. I think this state of affairs helps to explain why discussions of Pharaonic political boundaries have focused extensively on the relative permeability or linearity of ancient Egyptian tASw. And of course, many Pharaonic concerns about borders are readily intelligible to us. Undoubtedly, the Egyptian state wished to control the terms on which people immigrated to and from its territory and regulate commercial transactions within its boundaries. There was often a very real impetus to route both people and goods along clearly defined channels, both to render such migration and commerce legible to the state and taxable in the forms of customs dues or fees, and also to safeguard against potential threats, either in the form of emigrating fugitives or invading armies. The sizable frontier fortresses sponsored by the Pharaonic state, together with the wealth of communications discussing surveillance or monitoring efforts in boundary lands, attest to this emphasis, at least during particular times and in specific places. And certainly, Pharaonic scribes were capable of extreme prejudice when discussing foreign peoples, to the extent that scholars have identified the representation of foreigners in some scenes or texts as wretched, vile, or chaotic as a particular topos in Egyptian artistic and textual representation. However, although evaluating Pharaonic political boundaries from the perspective of permeability is useful, I don't think it should dominate our investigation of these boundaries, if only because it's not the primary lens through which the Egyptians themselves are defining terms like tASw and Jero. Although most scholarship has justifiably emphasized that the function of the famous Fetem or seal fortresses at Jaro and Elephantine was to seal off entry to the Nile Delta and Nile Valley, it's critical to note that another function they possessed was more analogous to the practice of countersealing an object to acknowledge receipt. That is to say, they ensured that immigration, emigration, and commercial imports and exports were visible to state authorities. Moreover, Egyptian sources do not seem to treat the presence of foreigners deep within the territory of the Pharaonic state as any kind of border failure unless these individuals were overtly hostile. Less than 50 years after the establishment of Senwosret III's boundary at Semna in his 8th regnal year, the Semna dispatches record Egyptian interactions with so-called Magi near Mergissa, who have descended into the Nile Valley from the well of Yibhad, and other Magi who pledged their service to the pharaoh at Elephantine. In the later New Kingdom, letters attest to the Pharaonic state occasionally enlisting nomadic populations to protect mining expeditions. Complex commercial relationships were managed with pastoralists on the fringes of the Nile Valley and Delta, and of course, communities of so-called Pangrave peoples maintained distinct funerary traditions in the upper and middle Nile Valley during parts of the Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period. And of course, further north, the excavations at Tel el-Daba attest synthesis of Egyptian and Levantine cultural identities into new forms. All this is to say that any notion of an impermeable border at Semna seems to have dissipated rather quickly to the extent that it ever existed, and there is little evidence that many Egyptian administrators considered this a problem outside of the authors of certain lamentation or wisdom texts imagining a broader Egyptian national identity. Transgressions of boundaries are often portrayed in the textual record as a personal affront to the pharaoh's power, rather than the violation of a divinely sanctioned territorial entity. As Laurel Bestock has noted with respect to Egyptian representations of violence in the broader landscape, often there is not a simple binary casting the Egyptians as good and foreigners as chaotic evildoers. Rather, a dichotomy appears between the king and, quote, everyone else who is subject to his potentially violent control. Together with foreigners, Upper and Lower Egyptians could at times be included among the 9 bows, the symbol for the enemies of the crown. Indeed, judging from the harrowing details of Sinue's escape across the Sinai Desert and into the Levant in the famous literary text, one could charge that frontier fortresses and surveillance patrols existed almost as much to keep Egyptian subjects from fleeing beyond the reach of the state as they did to halt the immigration of foreigners. The responses of New Kingdom pharaohs to unwanted migrations are also telling. In the 20th dynasty, when confederations of Libyan groups and sea peoples attempted to settle in the Nile Delta, the problem seems less that such groups were settling in Egypt, but that they attempted to do so without acknowledging and accepting the pharaoh's suzerainty. Following his alleged victories, Ramses III apparently settled many of the captured Libyans in camps or forts within the Nile Delta, and presumably incorporated them into the text base of the Egyptian state. Similarly, Papyrus Harris and the Wilbur Papyrus mention significant numbers of Sherden peoples farming land in the Fayum or settled in nearby towns. Ramses III describes pacifying the captured and notes that they were provided with clothing and rations from the treasuries annually in some cases. So despite the brutal subjugation described in these texts, one is left with the impression that some groups largely achieved their aims of settling in the Nile Valley or Delta, albeit on terms dictated by the king. For imperial Egypt, a state boundary was a locus where the political theology of a divinely sanctioned pharaoh with theoretically limitless power to expand Egyptian territory confronted political and logistical realities that decidedly contrasted with such an expansive view of royal authority. The need to reconcile royal ideology with political, logistical, and administrative actualities at times necessitated a response, one that could take the form of establishing a tush. Analyzing the variety of practices that constituted the Pharaonic answer to this challenge demonstrates that there was not really a monolithic notion of border making that extended across the duration of Egyptian civilization. Even within the restricted time frame investigated in this talk, boundaries could be marked or unmarked, relatively linear or nonlinear, militarized or relatively peaceful, densely settled or sparsely populated, all according to various social, economic, political, or cultural exigencies. And here we see, of course, one of the most obvious ways that Egyptian pharaohs attempted to stage sovereignty, the remains of one of the most famous frontier fortresses at Buhin in Nubia. The mechanics of pharaonic boundary making are fairly well known, I would argue. During the Middle and New Kingdoms, these included fortress construction, surveillance patrols, the establishment of boundary stelae, and the sponsorship of diplomatic, commercial, and military expeditions into foreign lands. Nonetheless, a unifying feature in pharaonic border making is that all of these practices very ostentatiously assert pharaonic sovereignty, whether in the form of monumental constructions, opulent diplomatic gifts, or the meticulous surveillance of desert paths. Beyond functionally aiding the Egyptian state in its efforts to project power into liminal spaces, monumental fortresses were potent symbols of Egyptian political authority. Not only did fortifications inspire a kind of sovereign awe, but in many instances, they were constructed using a quintessentially Egyptian architectural style that could be readily distinguished from indigenous or more domestic Egyptian architectural practices. At frontier fortresses, some gateways and commemorative stelae were decorated with violent imagery of the pharaoh triumphing over his enemies in battle. The monumentality and consummate functionality of large enclosure walls also facilitated their adoption as powerful political symbols for state authority. Military campaigns, of course, very flagrantly demonstrated the violent power of the pharaoh, sometimes culminating in the dedication of stelae in visually prominent locations in the borderlands. And I would argue that similarly, some of the elaborate pageantry and social protocols reflected in diplomatic exchanges, ritualized gift-giving, and tribute ceremonies offered Egyptian kings the opportunity to assert pharaonic power in a slightly less combative manner in peripheral or marginal regions. All of the practices noted above, patrols, military bases, walls, signage, and diplomatic ceremonies, form integral parts of modern border maintenance as well, and scholars have rightly drawn attention to these parallels. However, I want to argue that there are some very real distinctions between the ends that these performances of sovereignty were serving. In contrast to modern polities where basic human and legal rights are predicated upon citizenship or sanctioned residency within a state, privileges or special dispensations within Pharaonic Egypt tend to be doled out on the basis of an individual's social and material capital together with their utility to the pharaoh or the state's most powerful officials and institutions. In contemporary international law, borders exist to regulate the territory within which the state's sovereignty is absolute, at least in theory, if not in practice. For Pharaonic Egypt and its Near Eastern contemporaries, the reverse is almost true. Very rarely is there any kind of acceptance of limitations on the sovereign's capacity to decide on how things are going to go in the wider world, even though this was a de facto reality. Although Pharaonic sovereign power could inscribe itself upon the landscape if the ruler so desired, it was certainly not equivalent to modern territorial sovereignty, since the pharaoh's authority was, again, in theory, if not practice, absolute, and unconstrained by territorial limits. So in this sense, I think it kind of corresponds more closely with a later Roman concept of imperium, a designation of political authority not predicated on territorial control. That tASw were an embodiment of the power and potency of the ruler was thus an end unto itself. Projecting power across space was very difficult for ancient polities. In the absence of technology like motor vehicles or information age surveillance equipment, political control was concentrated in nodes of authority rather than equally and evenly blanketing an entire territory. tASw were a method of underscoring royal authority in peripheral locations, far beyond the king's physical presence, whether through coercive or persuasive measures. The use of less militaristic border-making practices to establish tASw, and here I'm thinking of, say, the trading expedition Hatshepsut sponsored to Punt, for example, that seems to be referenced in one of her Karnak obelisks. These kinds of less militaristic border-making practices stress how IMOC Egyptian notions of territoriality often place less emphasis on the state's right to use natural resources or even exert administrative control over a given territory than any modern state. The pharaoh could choose to declare such privileges, and indeed doing so might constitute best practices according to certain Egyptian didactic texts. However, this does not seem to have been inherent to the Egyptian state's conception of a tASw, and would help to account for the numerous instances in Pharaonic history where rulers plainly did not assert such rights within the tASw they claim to have established. The Amarna letters indicate the Pharaonic state prioritized being able to marshal what I would describe as superlative violent force, the biggest army, in its Levantine territories, but it was not especially troubled that it lacked a monopoly on its legitimate usage as its vassals jockeyed for position against one another. More important was that tASw were unilaterally declared and enforced by the king relative to other polities, a fact that Amenhotep II's stelae at Amata and Elephantine frankly acknowledges, stating there is no foreign land that can make a tash with him, as they live through his breath. Boundary stelae would seem to be a practice that claimed specific territory, but even here a closer examination also reveals nuances. Within Egypt, boundary stelae delineated individual fields or nomes and could demarcate linear borders. As a practical matter, though, they do not seem to have been all that extensively employed. Rare examples have been excavated or depicted in kingdom tomb reliefs, as we see here, but more frequently, we tend to find donation stelae, or statues recording the total acres that had been allotted to an individual or donated to a temple, and were housed in important religious sanctuaries. A practical solution, given that variation in Nile floods often meant that fields had to be resurveyed each year following the inundation. Given that such donations were likely also recorded and reduplicated in any cadastral surveys, censuses, or local administrative bookkeeping, I think that the materiality of these objects was, of course, a crucial element of their appeal. Not only did their stone composition evoke a sense of permanence, but oftentimes the images on the lunette of the stele referenced local deities or the king. These reliefs, together with the frequent placement of stelae in temples, highlight how such objects were sanctioned by the divine and backed by the legal and military apparatus of the state. That is to say, it's their capacity to theatrically evoke sovereignty that explains part of their appeal. Whether they were markers of internal administrative boundaries, individual fields, or even commemorating the act of establishing other tASw, such stelae provide a concrete and durable stage where political power could be ostentatiously displayed. Furthermore, there is little reason to expect that a pharaoh's decision to erect boundary stelae in borderlands was related to ensuring that the Pharaonic polity could economically exploit or administer all of the land encompassed by such monuments. Unsurprisingly, royal boundary stelae appear to have been employed most prominently when boundaries were contested or seemed insecure, and the ruler most desperately wished to assert their primacy. Thus, a series of early 12th dynasty kings took great pains to carefully demarcate the boundaries of powerful middle nomarchs. Famous pharaoh Akhenaten dramatically used boundary stelae to claim lands for the royal capital at Amarna, and as discussed above, some of the most militaristic rulers in Pharaonic history used stelae to claim boundaries at the far reaches of Egyptian empire. But what is notable in all of these cases, I think, is that the specific delineation of territory is arguably less important than the fact that the king was claiming it in the first place. In contrast to individual field markers that existed to influence the limits of one farmer's plot and, of course, profoundly affected how land was cultivated, royally dedicated boundary stelae, I think, probably had only limited effects on land usage. Whether Amarna or the Oryx nome encompassed several additional acres of land was largely unimportant. The crucial point was that the pharaoh had deemed it necessary to intervene and establish a new order. This was arguably even more valid at the margins of the state itself, where the presence of potentially hostile forces meant that the state-sanctioned economic activity was in many respects concentrated in the vicinity of particular nodes, either agriculture and trade near robust fortresses or settlements, or heavily defended expeditions intended to facilitate commercial exchange, diplomatic outreach, or extract natural resources. Rather than prioritizing contiguous or linear territorial claims, the various boundary-making practices described above allowed the Pharaonic state to control particularly important nodes, police the movement of people, and regulate commercial routes. Now, contemporary borders are pretty impersonal institutions. They belong to nation states, not individual political leaders. Language describing them as natural or located at natural boundaries makes them seem both logical and permanent, while much international law contrives to ensure that they remain so. Similarly, the violence of maintaining political borders is often masked by speech that suggests the state is merely enforcing its rights. In short, a host of practices attempt to abstract modern borders into eternal, ahistorical features, even though paradoxically the majority of these practices can be linked to the very specific historical trajectory of political boundaries in Western Europe over the past 5 centuries. The search for quote-unquote natural environmental boundaries between states in the 16th and 17th century was already conducted in the service of geopolitical goals, albeit cloaked in a language implying rationality. The advent of modern nationalism in the following centuries changed the ideal political boundary from one governed by natural landmarks to one encompassing the cultural entity that comprised the nation. So in effect, national borders have become the new natural borders, but without jettisoning any of the earlier presumptions of rationality or objectivity. In contrast, Pharaonic tASw were often conceived of in personal terms, as boundaries belonging to a particular ruler. Senwosret III describes his tASw in such language in a pair of stelae dedicated in his 16th regnal year at Uranarti and Semna respectively, describing it in his address as my boundary, and disowning any future pharaohs that might fail to fight for it. Throughout the New Kingdom, epithets of pharaohs refer to his boundary or boundaries, particularly when discussing efforts to make a tASw at a specific location, but also sometimes when describing the limits of Egyptian sovereignty granted by the gods in more general terms. To be sure, many texts reference the tASw Kemet, or boundaries of Egypt, or make reference to boundaries without a personal pronoun, and many pharaohs were hailed as one who expands Egypt. Yet the context where these more general descriptions of political boundaries occur is also illustrative, as they frequently occurred during moments when the king needed to rally mass support against alleged enemies who often already occupied large swaths of the Nile Valley or Delta, or prior to wars of expansion in the Levant. Such phrasing was also used at precisely the moments when appealing to and attempting to construct a broader national identity might prove most valuable. Examples abound from the late 17th and early 18th dynasty, when the Theban kings were desperately attempting to rally broader support for their wars against the Hyksos in the Delta and the Kushite polity to the south, as well as from the 20th dynasty, when migrating Libyans and sea peoples threatened Egyptian hegemony on multiple fronts. The personal connection of the ruler to his or her tASw and the wider boundary-making practices of the state has multiple important implications. First, it underscores how setting international borders was a royal prerogative. A commonality among all ancient Egyptian Inter-Polity countries is that they were the privilege of the ruler to establish as he or she saw fit. The pharaoh might delegate the responsibility for measuring fields or perhaps setting internal boundaries to the vizier or other high officials, but only the king could establish the margins of his own theoretically limitless sovereignty. The name of the ruler figures prominently in many of the completed rock inscriptions or stelae known from Pharaonic borderlands, often inscribed at particularly bright, effective places in the landscape. In the same vein, the official names of many fortresses either included the name of the king directly in their title or could be interpreted as an epithet of said ruler. For example, we can consider the bellicose names of many of Senwosret III's Second Cataract fortresses, together with the frequent inclusion of an individual king's nomen and praenomen in the title of many 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasty fortifications. And I would argue that this suggests that the grandiose display of personal power and royal authority was a real component of such constructions as well. Second, the use of personal pronouns to link a particular pharaoh to his or her tASw deliberately fuses the ruler and the state into a single entity. The linkage of power and authority to the body and actions of the pharaoh has deep roots in Egyptian prehistory, as convincingly demonstrated by David Wengrow and Alice Stevenson. Early dynastic kings asserted control over the production of slate palettes, cylinder seals, ornate daggers, or ritual mace heads, in part because these ceremonial objects and implements help to, quote, equate the transformation of the self with the transformation of the cosmos, and in doing so, they fashion the body of the ruler as a container for sacred power, end quote. If these ritual objects are concerned with cosmic transitions and boundaries at the level of the individual body, the later tASw of Middle and New Kingdom pharaohs, I would argue, tackle comparable subjects, albeit on a macroscopic scale. tASw were the social and material practices that these rulers used to bend the cosmos to their will, manifested through the generative force of personal royal action. And finally, the personal nature of tASw finds a close parallel in ancient Near Eastern treaties that were concluded between individual kings and had to be renewed upon the accession of a new ruler. This is not particularly surprising, since setting, establishing, or fixing a tASh, or choosing not to do so, was itself a form of diplomatic outreach, or at least a method of royal communication with Egyptian subjects themselves, the divine, and people beyond the reach of pharaonic authority. This parallel with terms of vassalage or alliance suggests that the Egyptians do not seem to have conceived of them as marking indelible, immovable boundaries akin to some modern borders, since tASw constantly needed to be reaffirmed, expanded, or refixed through royal action. Efforts to establish boundaries firmly and enduringly forever and ever through boundaries or carvings at visually prominent locations belied considerable anxiety about their future. Indeed, Senwosret III's pleas for future pharaohs to fight for his border on his year 16 stele emphasize this very point, as there is the explicit concern that his successors would simply ignore his tASh. In the case of boundaries delineating Middle Egyptian nomes from the 12th dynasty, the autobiography of Khnumhotep II references how a series of kings, Amenemhat I, Senwosret I, and Senwosret II, each established the boundaries of the Oryx nome, suggesting that even some internal boundaries had to be at least ritually reaffirmed with the accession of a new king. Egypt's circumscribed geography and the occasions when particular pharaohs did choose to ostentatiously and strenuously mark their tASh have understandably led scholars to recognize parallels between Egyptian boundaries and the borders of their own nation-states. But such parallels have at times been emphasized at the expense of certain fundamental differences in the pharaonic approach to boundary making. This has led to numerous assumptions about life in ancient Egyptian borderlands as being governed by modern rather than pharaonic notions of territoriality, as scholars have sought to identify rigid, clearly demarcated boundaries that contain a completely integrated territorial administration, and whose limits correspond to regions inhabited by various ethnic groups identified in Egyptian sources. This reifies or elides entirely the flexible identities of many individuals inhabiting the borderlands and risks uncritically transposing modern fantasies of culturally homogeneous, naturally bounded states to the Bronze Age. Such misconceptions, I think, have been particularly detrimental for the study of ancient Nubia. Ruth Trigger, in particular, stressed that ethnocentric textual sources reflecting ancient Egyptian perspectives on Nubia have been even further distorted by the racist and colonialist perspectives of many of the Western archaeologists and philologists tasked with interpreting this material. However, the assumption of firm borders separating distinct ethnic groups does not reflect pharaonic understandings of race or territoriality, but instead credulously accepts the tacit assumptions that 19th and 20th century excavators made about these topics when they were first analyzing the material culture of the Egyptian and Nubian Nile Valley. I think as a discipline, Egyptology must reckon with the reality that the culture groups identified by early excavators, the toponyms known from Egyptian sources, and the tASh claimed by the Egyptian state often seem to have no direct correspondence with one another, or are far more loosely associated than expected. Unstated assumptions about pharaonic political boundaries contributed to numerous misconceptions about ancient Nubian civilization that have since been revised in recent years. It seems likely that there was far less segregation between Nubian and Egyptian communities than many Egyptological scholars, than much Egyptological scholarship has traditionally assumed, both during and prior to the dynastic period. Material culture and ritual practice linked groups across the Long Nile Valley during the 5th and much of the 4th millennium BCE, while recent scholarship has highlighted the employment of Nubians near Middle Kingdom fortresses, together with the need to move beyond simple colonizer-colonized or center-periphery binaries. The implications of redating certain C group phases require further investigation and will likely spur further reevaluation of chronology towards the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. During the New Kingdom, Nubian material culture is not only relatively prominent in the southernmost nomes of Upper Egypt, but these regions at times were considered part of the same viceregal administrative unit helmed by the king's son of Cush. Earlier narratives of the straightforward assimilation of indigenous Nubians to Pharaonic culture, so-called Egyptianization, have also been rigorously challenged in recent years. This isn't to deny the often brutal realities of Pharaonic control of Nubia, but it is a call for scholars to recognize that even in their most bombastic, propagandistic texts or images, Egyptian pharaohs often were not claiming territory in the sense of a modern state. The many different practices employed to create, fix, renew, strengthen, or extend such boundaries reflect the versatility of the term tash. Rather than following contiguous borders or specific territorial claims, the tASw established at Egypt's international political boundaries theatrically asserted pharaonic power in liminal spaces. These constellations of stelae, reliefs, fortresses, and patrols suggest that the pharaohs of Egypt's Middle and New Kingdom sought to demonstrate their authority, often in visually prominent clusters. The existence of tASw was not predicated on distinguishing Egyptian territory from a chaotic exterior realm that, in theory, could be forcibly appropriated by the king on a whim. Instead, stelae, rock art, fortifications, reconnaissance detachments, and royal campaigns announced a horizon where individuals could be subjected to the violent force of the king and the pharaonic state. So in sum, I've sought to identify several key elements that distinguish pharaonic boundary making from modern practices. First, Egyptian sources define their boundaries not in terms of porosity or permeability, but rather the capacity for royal action to alter them, a stark contrast to contemporary border making practices that almost uniformly center the importance of controlling immigration, emigration, and interstate commerce. Second, a divinely sanctioned pharaoh with theoretically boundless power meant that the limitations imposed by political, social, military, and logistical realities presented distinctly different challenges to the theology of the pharaonic state than those engendered by most modern boundaries. For the pharaohs, the practices related to creating, fixing, or acknowledging a tash focused upon the conspicuous staging and display of Egyptian power in liminal spaces. Finally, in contrast to modern polities, borders are abstracted, linear entities that aspire to a kind of timelessness or atemporality. Egyptian tASw related to political boundaries are very often discussed in intensely personal terms. They can be described as belonging to an individual ruler or linked to the actions of specific kings or queens, and needed to be reaffirmed, expanded, and reestablished upon the succession of a new pharaoh to the throne. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen too.
Thank you very much, Oren. Great lecture, great seminar. I hope there will be many questions for you. You can use raise your hand, or you can just show yourself in the screen, or send a message, send a chat message. Okay, Tony. Unmute yourself.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Right. Wonderful. So you say that the tASw were not permanent. Is there any examples where stelae were moved from one place to another because of the fact that they weren't permanent, or is they just replaced and the old one discarded?
That's a really fascinating point, and I'm not actually aware of any examples of that with like international political boundaries. But this was a huge concern with the field boundaries. I'll see. Actually, I'll just really briefly share my screen again, because in one of the reliefs where you see I believe it's from the tomb of Nebamun, where there's a depiction of a field boundary. There's actually an oath being sworn where man in the field is making sure that everyone knows that this stele is in the spot, in its exact correct place, since it was very much a concern for Egyptians that, well, really anyone would be concerned if their field suddenly grew massively smaller. But I'm actually not quite sure of instances where boundaries, I mean, part of this I think is just the very limited number of Inter-Polity so-called boundary stelae that we're aware of too.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Any question? Yes, Laura?
Hi, I was going to type this into the chat, but I can't find it on my computer, so apologies. Thank you so much for the talk. This was really interesting. My particular field within Egyptology is early material, pre-dynastic and early dynastic. And I'm curious, given the significant economic and ceremonial importance of borders, the evidence that you presented today during really the Middle and the New Kingdom, do you think we could use the appearance of rock art with pharaonic names or even just depictions of the pharaoh, or objects and animals that could represent the pharaoh even, could we use that as the earliest delineation of boundaries in Egypt and use it as an identifying marker as the beginning of the Egyptian state?
This is a really great question, and I'll try to answer it as best I can. But I think certainly with rock art, one needs to be quite careful. Just in the, like, I remember one of our colleagues at Poznan describes thinking of rock art as kind of a map of people's movements, and so I certainly think that there can be elements of boundary making that are associated with this practice. I sort of cheat, I feel like, by looking at these later periods where we have texts that are describing not exactly what's going on, but more fully. But I certainly think that, yeah, for me, there are all kinds of parallels. But whether I could, I'm not sure I would be totally comfortable saying that all instances where the king is being displayed in the, I guess I would say, I'm not sure it's necessarily delineating boundaries, but it could certainly be viewed as part of the practices associated with boundary making, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, probably a site like Nagalam Dullab can have this kind of function to creating the borderscape.
And I think that it probably makes sense to, at least thinking about some of the earlier examples of rock art, it is really really fascinating, the distinctions between, I don't know if we want to call it more like official representations, where there's sort of recurrent patterns of how boats appear, or how the king is displayed, compared to some of the other kinds of rock art in the landscape as well. Oh, did I freeze?
No.
Oh, okay. Good.
Any other question? If not, okay, Philip.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I have one comment perhaps and one question. The comment is that which is in line with what you said. I believe that this difference between modern and ancient perception of the boundary lies in the general difference of perception of the state, namely that I believe that before 18th century and the Enlightenment, in European Enlightenment in general, there is no notion of the state as an independent phenomenon from the person who holds the power, right? So this might explain why the concept of the boundary of the tASw is so strictly connected with the person of the king. That would be the comment. And the question is, have you looked at the, let's say, on the other side of extending the borders, namely on the phenomenon how sometimes the names can change the determinatives? Like, for example, in the New Kingdom period, some of the Nubian localities have the determinative of the foreign land, the desert, while under the 25th dynasty, the same localities can be inscribed with the Egyptian town determinative. This also can give us a clue on how these borders might change, and the perception of what is Egypt and what is not might have changed through time. That would be all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Teterka, for this, an astute comment. And yeah, I haven't looked at the determinative specifically, but that's a great point and I think a promising avenue for future research. And I'd also add, I think, yeah, I use the term state more than I would have liked in this lecture, just because I think you're exactly right, and that and certainly other much more eminent scholars have written about sort of the problems. Much more eminent scholars than myself have written about the problems of projecting ideas about the state back into the ancient world. I mean, I often wonder if it makes as much sense to think of kind of the Pharaonic state as almost like an organized crime racket or something, where we're trying to extract as many resources as possible, and it'd be a real shame if something happened to this gold mine you're running over here. That sort of thing, where I think, like the sort of what it means to be a quote unquote citizen of the New Kingdom, I think, is probably quite a bit different in terms of, not to say that there weren't obligations that the state owed its subjects, but just that this sort of negotiation is quite different than ones that we're used to. And so I think that's a really important point that you made.
Yeah, we're still using probably the terminology that doesn't fit with the reality that we have now in our scholarship, but it's still a terminology that we need to use because that's what we have. We don't have a better choice for the time being. Any other question, comments? If not, I have a question. Can you see any difference between how the border is addressed and perceived from the same pharaoh? I mean, is the same pharaoh dealing with the southern border differently compared to the northern one? Can we see any difference?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I guess I would certainly make a distinction between royal rhetoric and how like tASw are being talked about, where it's often very much the ideology of pharaohs is very much comes through, and in all cases. And I think a lot of times, like, I'm thinking of Thutmose I and Thutmose III in particular, where they're really describing their efforts at setting, I should say, at somewhere near Naharain in the Levant, and then at Kyrgyz in comparable fashions. But I think that the actual, this is maybe an instance where, like, archaeology or less, I guess, more administrative style text might furnish kind of countervailing evidence, where we I think, as others are aware, that approaches to the Egyptian imperial territory in the Levant or in Nubia or say in America, often they were quite practical in deploying quite different policies. But I'm actually, others who are more knowledgeable with some of these royal texts might be able to chime in here. But I'm personally am not aware of any distinctions where they're sharply distinguishing between this is this is how we approach a tASw on the Nubian border, and this is how we approach one, say, near Libya or in the Levant.
Thanks. Any more questions? If not, we can stop here. Thanking again Oren for this really great seminar, who is really, it's your research from many years now, and it really fit very well with the Borderscape project. So thank you very much for this final, let's say, overview. And I remember that what Oren told us today has been published recently, last year, no? Was 2021, right? In Journal 22, Journal of Ancient Egyptian History.
Yeah, Journal of Egyptian History, yes.
Journal of Egyptian History. So if you want to have a look at that paper, it's worth it. So have a look at that. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. This is the last seminar for now, but we will resume after the summer with more seminars. So stay in touch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.